Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. Back on September 5th of 2006, Hillary Clinton, running to be re-elected for her Senate seat in New York, was doing the rounds. On this particular occasion, she was speaking to the Jewish press in Brooklyn, where she had this to say about the elections in Palestinian territories in 2006.
Troubled me deeply. I do not think we should have pushed for an election in the Palestinian territories. I think that was a big mistake. And if we were going to push for an election, then we should have made sure that we did something to determine who was going to win.
This audio recording was recently played by the Observer's Eli Chomsky, who was an editor and staff writer for the Jewish press back then. Joining us today to talk about this recently published recording of Hillary Clinton is Shir Hever. And in the past, you've heard from Shir Hever at The Real News, but today he joins us as a Real News correspondent and producer, joining us from Heidelberg, Germany. Thanks so much for joining us, Shir.
Great to be here, Shammi.
So, Shir, place this statement by Hillary Clinton in its historical context for us.
Well, she was making this comment in September 2006, at which point I think it's very useful to know that she's willing to admit that the U.S. was the one pushing for this election in Palestine, where the Palestinians, of course, they wanted to have an election. They wanted to have an election for a long time. They were not allowed. With this kind of a very strange move by U.S. President at the time, Bush, they were suddenly pressured to have an election as if that would somehow make their claim for independence and freedom from occupation more legitimate. And even though these elections were very carefully observed by international actors, by various states that sent their representatives to make sure that there are no tampering. The results were very disappointing for the United States and for the European Union, when the Hamas party won by a landslide majority.
They won by a majority of seats in the legislative election, and historically Hamas was supported by a very small percentage of the population, but in this occasion they won a majority. Why?
The majority, a lot of Palestinians say that the reason that Hamas won this election was because it was a protest vote. Because the Fatah party, which was the majority party until that point, was accused by the general Palestinian population of not doing enough to end occupation, not doing enough to protect Palestinians' rights and freedoms. And so the Hamas party, which was the major opposition party, and promised to be more, they promised a clean hands administration. That means they promised to fight corruption. They got a very large support from people who didn't necessarily subscribe to all of their political views and the religious views, but saw them as an alternative and as a kind of protest vote against the Fatah party. I think that's something very interesting, especially now in the context of the US elections, because the idea that some people vote as a protest vote to a candidate that they don't necessarily support is something that's spoken a lot. The lesson that can be learned from what happened in Palestine in 2006 might be relevant for the United States as well.
Now, then what was the reaction to all of this by, say, Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority, the Israelis themselves, and the American government about Hamas's legislative victory here?
Yeah, well, the Hamas party, even though their basic political demand is legitimate, they want an end to the occupation, but they're also an Islamic party, and they've also supported resisting the occupation by use of violence. And because of that, the major part of the Israeli, as well as the US, propaganda and narrative about why Palestinians can't be trusted to have their own state was that Hamas is a terrorist organization. Once Hamas won the election, that created a very serious problem for for all the international actors, actually. From the point of view of Israel, I think that's interesting to see that the Israeli government was not so quick to denounce the newly elected government and not so quick to cut all ties with them, because they were willing to keep on working with Hamas. But the United States was actually the one pushing to completely boycott the elected Hamas government and make it impossible for them to rule. And they have basically said that any international organization or any bank that does business with Hamas, with the Palestinian government, will be charged for assisting terrorism. And interestingly, the first thing that happened is that the biggest Israeli banks lost their biggest customer, because their biggest customer was the Palestinian government, and they couldn't do business with them anymore because of the US boycott and the threat of lawsuit. And so later, there was a series of very authoritative, very arrogant and patronizing moves by the international community, headed by the United States, but with complete support by the European Union as well, to force Palestinians to accept a kind of non-elected, appointed government, which was imposed upon them as the only way that public institutions will continue to function. So the only way that money will flow, banks will operate, schools will open, is if the Palestinians would renounce their democratically elected government. And as a result, there was, until today, a non-elected government in the West Bank, while in Gaza, the western part of the occupied Palestinian territory, the Hamas party has orchestrated a coup and took over the Gaza Strip by force, and they're still controlling it until this day.
And there's been horrendous consequences as a result of this kind of attitude that Hillary Clinton had, and which governed U.S. policy on Israel-Palestine for a long time now. But what does this attitude of Hillary Clinton's mean for the autonomy and self-determination of the Palestinian people if she becomes the president?
I think in that moment, Clinton demonstrated that her position on the Palestinians is not very different from the position that was held at the time by President Bush, that these people are simply not mature enough or not intelligent enough to know what is good for them. Somebody has to make that decision for them. And this kind of patronizing approach, even colonialistic approach, I should say, has unfortunately remained legitimate until today in a lot of U.S. policies. If Clinton becomes president and uses that kind of policy, then of course the results will continue to be, as they have been, catastrophic. Because whenever you tell people that you know what's good for them better than they themselves, people tend to react with frustration and anger. That's completely understandable. I think in many ways, what we see now in the United States with responses of people who are frustrated with the defeat of Bernie Sanders, for example, in the Democratic primaries, or people who want to support Trump, Donald Trump, just because that is their way to protest what they see as a rigged and unfair system. In many ways, that's what we saw actually in Palestine in 2006, because at the time when the election took place in January, the Israeli government confiscated signs which were advertising the Hamas party. They were arresting campaigners who were campaigning for Hamas, and then Hamas won by a very large majority. And I think that's something that needs to be taken into account. That such arrogant policies simply don't work.
And one final question, Shir. Do you think that a Clinton presidency towards Palestine and Israel would be different than that of Obama?
Well, I cannot predict the future, but I can see very clearly the voices that are heard from Palestinian actors, from various Palestinian parties and organizations that say but it doesn't really matter. The United States has a very clear policy in the Middle East where Israel is a major ally and for the United States, instigating violence in order to promote and sell US-made weapons. That's something that Palestinians are completely aware of. Palestinians serve as sort of lab animals. Of course, they're not animals, they're human beings, but they're treated as a ground for experiments for US weaponry by the Israeli military. This has been the policy in the times of Bill Clinton and George Bush and Barack Obama, who has increased military aid to Israel, meaning more US weapons that are going to get to the Israeli army. And there's no reason to believe that either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton will have any change in that kind of policy from their direction. There is going to be a change of policy, of course, but the change comes from the people on the ground through the protest of the Palestinians who are fighting for their freedom.
Shir Hever, thank you so much for joining us today and looking forward to your weekly reports.
Thank you very much, Armini.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.